In small towns, reputations are more valuable than gold. A smiling handshake, a wave across the street, a shared cup of coffee, these are the currencies of trust. In Willow Creek, Montana, Nathaniel and Veronica Porter were seen as the kind of couple others quietly envied. High school sweethearts who had turned youthful love into a lifetime bond, they seemed to embody everything the town cherished: loyalty, ambition, and the promise of forever. Their world was filled with Sunday morning breakfasts, neighborhood barbecues, and whispered prayers of gratitude for a future now brightened by the news of their first child. To an outsider, their life seemed sealed tight against tragedy. Yet, no one realized just how fragile the foundation beneath them had become, or how close Willow Creek was to bearing witness to a betrayal so profound it would shake the entire community to its core. You might be wondering, what could possibly shake a seemingly perfect marriage? What could drive a man to destroy everything he's built: a loving wife, a successful career, a reputation among his friends? Nate Porter was living the dream, until a secret tore him apart. He wasn't the first man to find himself caught between two worlds. Have you ever found yourself torn between loyalty and desire? Between what's right and what feels good in the moment? Nate had a choice, and like many of us, he let his impulses push him toward a decision that would not only ruin his life but also devastate those around him. But what happens when someone is pushed too far? What happens when the need for control becomes so intense that you'll go to any lengths to preserve your own narrative, even if it means rewriting the lives of those you claim to love? For Nate, the pressure from his mistress, Sienna Marks, was unbearable. She wanted more than just a fleeting affair, she wanted him. And with Veronica pregnant with his child, Nate was torn between two women. But the anger that simmered inside him didn't have to make sense. Sometimes, emotions can become so distorted that you lose sight of the truth, and the line between right and wrong fades into nothing. Do you think Nate was simply overwhelmed by the weight of his choices, or was this calculated from the start? From the outside looking in, Nathaniel, Nate Porter was the embodiment of small-town success. Raised in Willow Creek, Montana, Nate had been something of a local golden boy, charming, athletic, and endlessly polite. His father, Richard Porter, owned a modest but thriving construction company, and from a young age, Nate was expected to one day carry on the family business. It was a heavy expectation, but Nate wore it well. At least, that's what everyone thought. Veronica Lynn Taylor, later known as Veronica Porter, had moved to Willow Creek during her freshman year of high school. Her family relocated from Oregon after her father accepted a teaching job at the town's only high school. Shy but warm-hearted, Veronica quickly caught the attention of many, including Nate. By their junior year, they were inseparable. Prom, football games, lazy summer afternoons by Willow Lake. It was the kind of romance that people in town spoke of wistfully, convinced they were witnessing something rare. After high school, Nate stayed behind to help his father with the business, while Veronica attended a nearby community college, earning a degree in business management. They married at 23 in a ceremony held under a massive oak tree in the town park, surrounded by friends and family who saw their love as proof that real, lasting relationships still existed. Their early years together were, by most accounts, genuinely happy. Nate expanded the construction company, bringing in modern designs and new clients. Veronica opened The Velvet Ribbon, a boutique specializing in handcrafted clothing and home decor. The boutique quickly became a main street fixture, and Veronica's warm smile became a familiar comfort to the locals. They bought a cozy two-story home on Birchwood Lane. White trim, a big front porch, the kind of place that begged for a swing and Sunday barbecues. They adopted a golden retriever puppy named Daisy, hosted backyard dinners, and became godparents to their friends' children. To anyone watching, they were living a life most could only hope for. But inside that beautiful life, tiny fractures were forming. Their attempts to start a family were met with heartache. Veronica suffered 2 miscarriages over a span of 4 years. Losses that left scars far deeper than anyone realized. Veronica threw herself into her boutique, expanding the store's offerings and attending trade shows across the state. Nate, meanwhile, took on larger and more demanding projects at work, often returning home late and exhausted. Their grief turned into distance. Nate, once attentive and doting, became increasingly detached. Veronica noticed, of course, how could she not? But she chalked it up to stress and the invisible weight of shared sorrow. She suggested counseling, weekend getaways, anything to rekindle the spark. Nate agreed half-heartedly but rarely followed through. Still, when Veronica finally announced her pregnancy at the New Year's Eve party, she believed they had turned a corner. She had seen the flicker of happiness in Nate's eyes, or at least, she thought she had. The townspeople certainly celebrated with genuine joy. The Porters were getting their happy ending at last. What no one realized was that Nate was already slipping away. Months earlier, during a project to build new office spaces on the edge of town, Nate had hired a secretary, Sienna Marks. Young, vibrant, and quick with flirtatious banter, Sienna was a stark contrast to Veronica's steady, nurturing nature. What began as harmless conversation soon edged into dangerous territory. Late nights at the office became commonplace, justified by tight deadlines and mountains of paperwork. The flirtation escalated. Nate told himself it was nothing. A distraction. A bit of excitement to break up the monotony. But affairs rarely remain contained. Once a line is crossed, it becomes easier to cross it again, and again. Before long, Nate and Sienna were sharing hotel rooms under the pretense of business trips. They met at a rented cabin on the far side of Willow Lake, far enough from town to avoid recognition. At first, Sienna seemed content with secrecy. But as the months wore on, she grew restless. She wanted more. She wanted Nate, fully, publicly, without barriers. And when she discovered she was pregnant, her patience snapped. Sienna gave Nate a choice: leave Veronica before the baby was born, or she would expose everything. She wasn't bluffing. She threatened to send copies of their text messages, hotel receipts, even photos to Veronica, and worse, to Nate's clients and the town newspaper. Nate panicked that if this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it simply made you feel something deep inside, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. Every click helps us bring more hidden stories to light, and keeps the memories of those who can no longer speak for themselves alive. Divorcing Veronica would be more than just personally devastating, it would be a public scandal. Willow Creek was the kind of place where reputation meant everything. Nate would lose his standing, his clients, his friends. Worse, he would lose the identity he had spent his entire life building. And yet, staying with Veronica meant sacrificing the fantasy Sienna had dangled before him: a fresh start, a new family, a chance to be the man he wanted to be without the weight of his past mistakes. The walls were closing in. At home, Veronica was blissfully unaware. She filled the nursery with tiny outfits and painted a mural of forest animals on the wall. She attended prenatal yoga classes and researched birthing centers. She planned a gender reveal party that would gather all their friends and family to celebrate the life they had fought so hard to create. Meanwhile, Nate oscillated between panic and cold calculation. There were warning signs, if anyone had been looking closely enough. Nate grew increasingly irritable, snapping at Veronica over trivial matters. He missed prenatal appointments with flimsy excuses. He spent nights sleeping on the couch, claiming he didn't want to disturb her with his tossing and turning. Friends noticed the tension but chalked it up to normal pre-baby stress. After all, weren't all expectant couples a little on edge? The day of the gender reveal dawned crisp and clear, with a cool spring breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. Blue and pink streamers lined the park pavilion. Friends milled about, balancing plates of food and laughing under the open sky. Veronica was radiant, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. Nate stood beside her, smiling for the cameras, holding the giant black balloon between his hands. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. A burst of blue confetti filled the air. A boy. Cheers erupted around them. Veronica laughed and wiped tears from her eyes. And Nate? A photographer captured the moment. He lowered his gaze, his jaw tightening ever so slightly, his eyes flashing with something sharp and ugly. A baby boy. Not the daughter he had allowed himself to dream about with Sienna. Not the clean slate he had imagined. It was a quiet breaking point, small, almost imperceptible, but devastating. That night, as they packed away decorations and leftover food, Veronica chatted excitedly about baby names and nursery themes. She made plans for a maternity shoot, spoke of tiny socks and bedtime stories. Nate barely spoke at all. Inside him, a decision was forming. One that would shatter everything. It was 2 weeks after the gender reveal when it happened. A Saturday evening, April 14th. The sun had dipped behind the rolling Montana hills, casting a soft violet hue across Willow Creek. The day had been uneventful, quiet, almost deceptively peaceful. Veronica spent the afternoon organizing the nursery, carefully folding tiny onesies into dresser drawers and hanging a mobile above the crib. Nate claimed he needed to run errands, supplies for the house, he said, and left around 3 in the afternoon. He returned shortly after 6 with takeout from Veronica's favorite Thai restaurant. They ate together in the living room, Daisy curled up at Veronica's feet. Veronica chatted about baby showers and pediatricians, her voice light and full of hope. Nate barely touched his food. Around 8:30, Veronica decided to take a bath, a nightly ritual to ease the growing strain on her back. She lit candles, filled the clawfoot tub with lavender-scented bubbles, and sank into the warmth. It was the last moment of peace she would ever know. Authorities would later piece together a grim sequence of events. Sometime between 9 and 9:15, Nate entered the bathroom under the pretense of checking on her. He knelt beside the tub, taking her hand, telling her how much he loved her. Veronica smiled, reassured by the sudden tenderness. Then, in a swift and violent motion, Nate pressed her shoulders under the water. Veronica struggled, splashing and gasping, but she was 7 months pregnant, her body heavy and cumbersome. Nate, driven by a cold, terrible purpose, held her down. Her kicks weakened, her arms thrashed once, twice, and then fell still. The bathwater turned eerily calm. Nate waited, counting out loud to make sure there was no mistake. When he was certain, he drained the tub, lifted Veronica's lifeless body onto the bathroom floor, and staged the scene. He placed a broken glass bottle near her head, something she might have grabbed during a slip. He positioned her so that it appeared she had lost consciousness, hit her head, and drowned. He even splashed some water onto the tiles to add authenticity. Once satisfied, he made the 911 call. His voice was frantic but oddly measured, the kind of panic that sounds rehearsed if one listens closely enough. He told the dispatcher he had found his wife unconscious in the tub, that she wasn't breathing, that she was pregnant. Please, hurry. Emergency services arrived within minutes. Paramedics rushed into the house, finding Nate kneeling beside Veronica, performing chest compressions that did little more than bruise her already lifeless body. His hands shook, his face was pale, but there were no tears. Despite their efforts, Veronica was pronounced dead at the scene. The paramedics' faces were grim as they exchanged looks. Something about the situation didn't sit right. One of them noticed the slight indentation around Veronica's wrists, tiny crescent-shaped bruises. Another found it odd that, despite being submerged, her hair was almost completely dry. It hadn't been underwater long, they whispered among themselves. Protocol demanded that deaths of pregnant women be treated with high scrutiny. An officer was dispatched to secure the scene. Crime scene investigators followed shortly after. Nate sat on the living room couch, cradling his head in his hands, rocking slightly. He told Officer Ramirez, the first on the scene, that it was a tragic accident. Veronica had been tired. She probably fainted. He volunteered the story before anyone even asked. Still, Ramirez took detailed notes. Nate's demeanor wasn't quite adding up. In a town like Willow Creek, news travels faster than the speed of light. By sunrise, every diner, gas station, and grocery store buzzed with whispers. Veronica Porter, dead. Pregnant, no less. Mothers clutched their children closer. Church prayer groups formed instantly. Social media flooded with photos of Veronica, her laughing at the farmer's market, cradling Daisy, glowing at the gender reveal party just 2 weeks prior. The town mourned collectively, but underneath the sorrow lurked unease. Because even in their grief, people remembered. They remembered Nate's withdrawn behavior. His absence from prenatal classes. His scowls and forced smiles. Hushed conversations in the church parking lot pointed fingers. People started to ask questions. The autopsy results came back quicker than usual, an emergency measure given the pregnancy. Dr. Lillian Harrington, the county medical examiner, had seen her share of tragedy, but Veronica's case shook her. Cause of death, drowning. Manner of death, suspicious. Bruising around the wrists. Faint marks on the shoulders consistent with forceful submersion. No defensive wounds, possibly because of Veronica's condition, making it difficult for her to fight back. Worse still, the baby boy had survived for a short time after Veronica's death, his tiny heart beating in a desperate struggle before it, too, stilled. Dr. Harrington notified the sheriff immediately. Sheriff Paul Easton was a seasoned man, gruff, slow to judge, but he trusted his instincts. And his instincts told him Nate Porter wasn't telling the full truth. Nate was asked to come in for a follow-up interview. At first, he complied willingly, keeping his answers brief but consistent. Veronica must have fainted, he insisted. She'd been exhausted lately. Pregnancy was hard on her. Maybe low blood pressure. Maybe the heat from the bath. But the questions grew sharper. Where was he during the bath? Had there been an argument? Why hadn't he heard her fall or struggle? Nate's carefully constructed calm began to unravel. He fidgeted, contradicted himself. He said he had been downstairs watching TV, but the living room television was off and the remote untouched. He said he had been on the phone, but phone records showed no outgoing or incoming calls. Detectives, meanwhile, dug deeper. They subpoenaed Nate's cell phone records and found dozens of text messages to an unknown number. Further tracing revealed Sienna Marks. Investigators quickly learned she was not just a secretary. They brought Sienna in for questioning. At first, she was defensive, claiming she barely knew Nate outside of work. But when faced with evidence, hotel receipts, text messages, she crumbled. Through tears, she revealed the affair, the pregnancy, the ultimatum she had issued just weeks before Veronica's death. The motive crystallized before their eyes. Public reaction was swift and savage. Willow Creek was a small town with a long memory. They remembered Veronica's kindness, her devotion, her love for Nate. The idea that he could betray, and worse, destroy, that love sent shockwaves through the community. Vigils sprang up outside the Velvet Ribbon, candles flickering against the night sky. Handmade signs reading, "Justice for Veronica," leaned against storefronts. Strangers left flowers and baby toys on the Porter's front lawn, a silent, aching protest. When Nate was officially named a person of interest, it wasn't a surprise. It felt inevitable. Neighbors recalled how Daisy, the dog, had barked frantically around the bathroom door that night. Friends whispered about the gender reveal party, about how Nate's face had momentarily hardened when the blue confetti exploded into the air. And now, armed with forensic evidence, phone records, and a crumbling alibi, the authorities prepared to move forward. It would not be easy. Convicting someone in a case that could be spun as accidental death always carried risks. But the truth had weight. And little by little, that weight was crushing the lies Nate had so carefully built. The arrest came quietly. No sirens, no shouting. Just a firm knock on the Porter residence door at 6:17 a.m., one gray morning in late April. Nate answered, his hair tousled, wearing yesterday's jeans and a blank expression. Standing on his porch were Sheriff Paul Easton and two deputies. Their presence, their heavy silence, told him everything. "Nathaniel Porter," Easton said, "you are under arrest for the murder of Veronica Porter and her unborn child." The words hit the air like a stone shattering glass. For a moment, Nate simply stood there. Then, as if waking from a dream, he protested, weakly, almost mechanically, "You're making a mistake." The deputies moved efficiently, reading him his rights as they handcuffed him. Neighbors peeked through blinds and cracked doors. One woman gasped audibly from her driveway. Within minutes, half of Willow Creek would know. The booking process was swift. Mugshots. Fingerprints. A scratchy orange jumpsuit. The official charges, filed that afternoon, were chilling: first-degree murder of Veronica Porter. First-degree murder of a fetus under Montana's fetal homicide laws. Aggravated assault. Tampering with evidence. Nate sat stone-faced as the charges were read aloud in court, his hands cuffed at his waist, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the courtroom walls. Across the aisle, Veronica's parents, Beth and Samuel Parker, clutched each other's hands so tightly their knuckles turned white. Their grief was so palpable it filled the room like a fog. The prosecutor assigned to the case was Assistant District Attorney Caroline Vance, a sharp, unrelenting figure with a reputation for dismantling even the most slippery defendants. Vance stood before the judge, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a knife. "The evidence will show," she said, "that Nathaniel Porter, motivated by selfish desire and cowardice, deliberately murdered his wife, 7 months pregnant with their son, in a calculated act designed to appear accidental. It was not a momentary lapse. It was cold, it was premeditated, and it was monstrous." The defense attorney, Charles Grady, took a different tone. Grady was a veteran of the courtroom, silver-haired, smooth-voiced, a master of doubt. His argument was simple. There was no proof Nate intended harm. There were no eyewitnesses. There was only tragedy, twisted by grief into accusations. This, Grady said, pacing before the jury box, was an accident. A terrible, heartbreaking accident. We must not allow grief to cloud reason. The stage was set. The media descended on Willow Creek like locusts. News vans parked outside the courthouse. Reporters camped in front of the Velvet Ribbon. National headlines dubbed Nate the bathwater killer. Tabloids speculated wildly, suggesting secret insurance policies, a history of domestic abuse, even satanic cults. The truth, as always, was more devastating than fiction. At the preliminary hearings, Vance presented her case methodically, cell phone records showing Nate's ongoing affair with Sienna Marks. Text messages between Nate and Sienna hinting at a future without obstacles. Autopsy results revealing bruising inconsistent with a simple slip and fall. Daisy's behavior that night, corroborated by neighbor testimony, suggesting agitation and barking before emergency services were called. Forensic evidence, hair samples, water patterns inconsistent with Nate's version of events. Every detail painted a portrait of premeditation. The defense, for their part, clung to ambiguity. They called expert witnesses who testified that fainting spells during pregnancy were common. They pointed out that no one had seen Nate commit the crime. They suggested the bruises on Veronica's body could have been caused during frantic rescue attempts. And crucially, they leaned heavily on character witnesses. Former co-workers, distant relatives, even high school friends lined up to describe Nate as kind, quiet, gentle. But underneath it all, a darker narrative emerged. During discovery, Vance unearthed bank statements showing Nate had emptied their joint savings account 2 days before Veronica's death. A private investigator hired by Vance found evidence Nate had applied for a new apartment lease, with Sienna's name listed as an emergency contact. He hadn't planned to stay in Willow Creek at all. He had planned a clean break, a fresh start, with a dead wife and a grieving town none the wiser. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. Every click helps us bring more hidden stories to light. One major twist rocked the trial midway through. Sienna Marks, originally uncooperative, requested a deal with the prosecution. In exchange for limited immunity, she agreed to testify against Nate. In a packed courtroom, she took the stand. Tears streamed down her face as she recounted conversations with Nate. She testified that he complained constantly about feeling trapped, that he said Veronica's pregnancy had ruined everything, that he needed a way out. Most damningly, she recalled Nate saying, weeks before Veronica's death, "Accidents happen all the time. Slippery floors, fainting spells. Sometimes life hands you an escape if you're willing to take it." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Veronica's mother sobbed openly. The defense attempted to discredit Sienna, painting her as a jilted lover seeking revenge. But the jury could feel it, the raw, horrifying truth buried in her testimony. Another revelation followed. Detectives found a deleted search history on Nate's laptop, "How long to drown in bathtub pregnant?" Accidental drowning signs. Making death look like accident. The defense argued that there was no proof Nate conducted those searches. But the timestamps, made during the exact hours Veronica napped upstairs weeks earlier, made it almost impossible to deny. By the time closing arguments began, the case felt heavy, inevitable. Vance's final words to the jury burned into memory: Veronica Porter trusted her husband. She loved him. She carried his child. And in return, he betrayed her in the most unforgivable way. This was not an accident. This was an execution. Grady, in his closing, could only appeal to emotion. When you remove your anger and your heartbreak, is there enough to be sure beyond a reasonable doubt? One mistake in judgment, and a man's life is ruined forever. The jury deliberated for 4 days. Tensions outside the courthouse reached a fever pitch. Protesters chanted for justice. Supporters of Nate, dwindling but vocal, carried signs claiming conspiracy and witch hunts. Inside, families waited, holding their breath. And then, finally, a verdict. The trial of Nathaniel Porter was, from its very first day, a spectacle. The small, wood-paneled courtroom at the Willow Creek County Courthouse had never seen such a procession of cameras, journalists, and anxious citizens. Every bench was packed. Every hallway buzzed with low murmurs and strained faces. At the heart of it all sat Nate, thin, pale, the orange of his jumpsuit peeking out beneath a wrinkled blazer provided by his defense team. He rarely spoke, even to Grady. His gaze flickered between the judge, the jury, and the empty chair where Veronica should have been seated, smiling, supporting him. Instead, across the room sat her grieving parents, the Parkers, a photograph of Veronica cradling her swollen belly clutched tightly in Beth's hands. It was the testimony of Sienna Marks that lit the match to the courtroom's simmering tension. Under direct examination by ADA Caroline Vance, Sienna's voice trembled but grew stronger with each word. She told of secret meetings, of whispered promises to start fresh, of conversations where Nate had spoken about freak accidents and untraceable ways out. At one point, Vance displayed a printed text exchange between Nate and Sienna, projected onto a large screen for the jury to see. Sienna: "I wish we could be together without all this mess. Nate, just a little longer. Things can change fast." The implication hung heavy in the air. During cross-examination, Grady tried to paint Sienna as a manipulator, desperate for attention after Nate pulled away. He questioned her credibility, highlighting inconsistencies in her previous police statements. But Sienna remained composed. "Did you love him?" Grady asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. "I thought I did," she replied. "Now I think I was just another tool he used." Her words left a raw ache in the room. The most devastating moment came when forensic pathologist Dr. Karen Lott took the stand. She described in clinical, unflinching detail how Veronica's body bore bruises around her wrists and forearms, defensive wounds. There were signs that she had struggled in her final moments, despite Nate's claims that she slipped and lost consciousness instantly. Water found in her lungs confirmed drowning. But the angle of bruising, Dr. Lott explained, suggested Veronica had been held under, not simply submerged after fainting. The courtroom was so silent during her testimony that one could hear the scratch of pens against notepads, the suppressed sniffles of mourners. When photographs of the bruises were shown on the courtroom monitors, Beth Parker let out a low, animalistic wail. She had to be helped out of the room by two friends. The prosecution rested their case heavily on these findings. Grady fought back hard. He brought in his own medical expert, Dr. Emmett Hayes, who argued that bruising could have occurred post-mortem, during rescue attempts. He showed video recreations of slip-and-fall bathtub accidents involving pregnant women, demonstrating how easily disorientation and drowning could occur naturally. He hammered on the lack of a murder weapon. He pointed to Nate's 911 call, playing it several times for the jury, highlighting Nate's panic, his gasping sobs. "This is not the voice of a killer," Grady insisted. "This is the voice of a husband watching his world fall apart." One of the most intense moments came when Nate himself took the stand. Against Grady's advice, he insisted on testifying. He described his marriage as loving but stressful, citing financial pressures, the unplanned pregnancy, and Veronica's mood swings. He admitted the affair with Sienna but insisted he had broken it off weeks before Veronica's death. "I never wanted Veronica hurt," he said, voice cracking. "I loved her. I loved our son." Under Vance's cross-examination, though, Nate stumbled. When asked why he hadn't mentioned the affair to police initially, he mumbled about protecting her memory. When confronted with the deleted search history, he claimed ignorance. When asked about his bank withdrawals and lease applications, he faltered, looking every inch the man cornered by the consequences of his choices. "Mr. Porter," Vance said sharply, leaning in, "isn't it true that you didn't want a wife and a child weighing you down? You wanted freedom, and you were willing to do whatever it took to get it?" Nate shook his head, but his answer was a whisper. The damage was done. In her closing, Vance delivered a devastating summation. Veronica trusted Nathaniel with her life, and he repaid that trust with betrayal. This was not a slip. Not an accident. It was a choice. Grady's closing was impassioned but felt desperate. "Reasonable doubt," he pleaded. "If even one of you questions whether this was murder, you must acquit." The jury was given instructions and sent to deliberate. After 4 harrowing days, during which the town held its collective breath, the jury returned. The courtroom was packed wall to wall, the air hot and trembling. Nate stood as the foreperson read the verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of first-degree fetal homicide. Guilty of aggravated assault. Guilty of evidence tampering. A scream, raw, victorious, heartbroken, escaped from Beth Parker's throat. Samuel Parker covered his face with trembling hands. Nate closed his eyes briefly. He sagged slightly, as if the weight of the moment had finally broken his spine. Judge Ruben Morales wasted no time. Citing the calculated, remorseless nature of the crime and the betrayal of the highest trust, he sentenced Nathaniel Porter to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for Veronica's murder. An additional 30 years for the fetal homicide charge. 5 years for evidence tampering, served consecutively. The courtroom erupted into sobs, some of relief, others of mourning for the lives lost and destroyed. Outside the courthouse, Veronica's parents gave a brief, tearful statement. "Justice was done," Samuel said, his voice hoarse. "But there are no winners today. We lost Veronica. We lost baby Jacob. Nothing can bring them back." Nate's parents issued no public comment. They were seen leaving the courtroom, heads bowed, faces ashen. The town of Willow Creek tried to heal, but scars remained. The Velvet Ribbon eventually closed its doors. No one had the heart to sip lattes in a place haunted by tragedy. The bathtub where Veronica died was removed and destroyed. The Porter house was put up for sale, but it sat empty for months, buyers wary of the whispers that clung to its walls. For the Parkers, the loss remained a daily ache. For Nate, prison loomed, a cold, gray eternity filled with regret, recriminations, and the endless question of whether it had all been worth it. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it simply made you feel something deep inside, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. Every click helps us bring more hidden stories to light, and keeps the memories of those who can no longer speak for themselves alive.